theory of sexual selection and the exciting potential it holds for a new understanding of aesthetics, for the role of the female in evolutionary biology, and for a rethinking of the relationship of sexual selection and its importance to natural selection. But I've got to give credit where it's due. This event is the brainchild of George Levine, who is a renowned and tireless student and the most respected of scholars of Darwin in the field of Victorian studies, in which I've spent my intellectual life. George Levine is the Kenneth Burke Professor of English Literature Emeritus at Rutgers University and a member of the Society of Senior Scholars at London University. Among his host of accomplishments are many fellowship awards, the NEH, Rockefeller, and Guggenheim, to name but three. His founding of the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers, which he directed from 1986 to 2006, and his 20-some-odd books. I asked him earlier how many, and neither one of us knew how many, but it's around 20, which he's published over the past 50 years. These include field-changing works like The Realistic Imagination in 1981, as well as several books with Darwin in their titles. Darwin and the Novelist in 1988, and one of, I don't know if it's his favorite title, but it is of many of us, Darwin Loves You, Natural Selection and the Reenchantment of the World in 2008. George is also my dear friend, and I'm most grateful to him for taking up my suggestion that he organize this panel.
Not to be applauded, I'm just going to be the MC today. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. As my friends know, when I first read Richard's book, I couldn't stop talking about it, dinners, wherever. I'm sure I bored people to death, but as a result of talking to Eileen, we're having this session here where I can hear the book discussed in ways that I'm not really capable of. The book struck me at first when I looked at the pictures, because I'm a birder. And if you haven't seen the book, it's a gorgeous book. I know that's not the way you want the book to be understood, but I got excited about it because it was about evolution, which I've spent a lot of time worrying about. It was about birds, and it turns out it's about aesthetics. It's a book that has all kinds of wonderful implications that I would love to see developed. As Richard said when I wrote to him and told him what I thought about the book, he said, "You've drunk the Kool-Aid." And I have indeed. The book absolutely persuaded me, although I have no scientific authority to confirm that Richard is absolutely right on everything. I would like to, it seems to me really important to get his ideas out here, because those ideas are really not about ornithology. They are about aesthetics. They are about how science is conducted. They are about evolutionary theory. And their implications are enormous. It's a book that you discover midway, or maybe not so midway. It's one of the most interesting arguments for feminism I've ever read. It's a book that opens up in fresh ways discussions of homosexuality and appropriately, from my point of view, demonstrates the inadequacy of certain dominant evolutionary theories. And I suffer from science envy. I have to admit that. And I wish I could speak with the kind of authority I'd like to speak of about the arguments that Richard has made, but I'm convinced by them. And I would like to hear them discussed by people who really know what they're talking about. So what I'm going to do today is introduce the people who really know what they're talking about. We'll first hear from Richard himself, who is the, the William Robertson Coe Professor of Ornithology and head curator of vertebrate zoology at Peabody Museum. He's a MacArthur Fellow. He knows all about dinosaur feathers, and he's written this extraordinary book, which, to my great joy, I'm sure to your joy too, turned out to be listed as one of the Times list of the best books of 2017. So that was a good take. But anyway, so Richard will speak first. Then Deborah Coen, who is chair of the History of Science and Medicine program at Yale University. She's the author of several books and is currently working. Is the climate book out? Is it?
July.
Okay. The book Climate in Motion: Science, Empire, and the Problem of Scale. That will be out in July. And you're now on leave doing work on climate change. Is that right? I read that somewhere.
Next
yes.
year, indeed.
Pretty clever.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Then we'll hear from Philip Kitcher, whose books fill my shelves. I haven't. John Dewey Professor of Philosophy at Columbia. I have not read his most recent book. In fact, Eileen was asking how many books I published. How many books have you published? I don't know. Anyway, a lot. I've read quite a few of them, and they move from mathematics to science to biology, and I encountered Philip first when I was writing about secularism and ethics. And his most recent book is called The Season After: How to Save Our Planet in 6 Acts.
It's co-authored with Evelyn Kelly.
Oh, that's right. No, that's fine. No, okay. So what we'll do is we'll have Richard present his arguments and have Deborah follow 15 minutes and Philip. Richard. Whoops, a lot of wires.
Well, thanks very much to George for thoughtfully organizing this, and also in advance to Deborah and Phil for their interest in engaging with the book and being with us tonight. I'm aware, having worked at the Whitney Humanities Center for a while at Yale, and also for a while I ran a program at Yale, and the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities as a hat tip to the humanities, our current context. I'm not going to give the traditional PowerPoint that we biologists love to lean on. So, but we do have some backup, really amazing bird videos in case the conversation lags. We can always go with it. So I won't focus on the biological details today, but to structure the argument and again emphasize some of the implications of the concept of aesthetic evolution. The core argument in the book is that there's a distinct mode of evolution that I characterize as aesthetic evolution that is an emergent property of 3 events: sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice. And when those things occur on a heritable substrate, then I'm proposing that we have a new mode of evolution that is explicitly aesthetic. The research requires, or is based on I think the observation that birds and other organisms, non-human animals, have subjective experiences. That is, a flow of experience that gives rise to opportunities for subjective evaluation that they operate on, or they put into action through choice. What this means is that animals are active agents in their own evolution. Now, the goal of the research is to bring beauty back into the sciences as a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry. And so I need to define beauty in a way that is both testable and investigatable in a scientific way. So this has been a real challenge in the history of philosophy from Plato to Kant and on. But my definition of beauty is not merely any kind of attraction or desire, but a special co-evolved attraction in which the form of desire and the object of desire have shaped one another over time through their interactions, their historical interactions, through choices, presentations based on expressions. So I would count beauty as just one of a variety of aesthetic properties or aesthetic values that a co-evolutionary process could give rise to. And they would include everything from co-evolved revulsion, like the experience of a skunk or a coral snake or a monarch butterfly to an appropriate predator, delight, and further on, at some point, passion, nostalgia, quaintness, humor, irony, a whole panoply or a variety of aesthetic experiences. Now, choices can be ecological choices, like foraging at a flower, or social choices, who do I hang out with? But the book, and today, mostly focuses on sexual choices, which gives rise to a special kind of co-evolved ornament, a form of sexual beauty. Now, until now, probably, it was likely that any evolutionary biologists in the audience may merely be annoyed at my desire to bring aesthetic language into the sciences, but there's not maybe anything yet to debate. So we'll go now into overt conflict with some of mainstream evolutionary biology. And that is because most of my colleagues believe that sexual ornament evolves because it provides information about objective quality that mates need to know or should need to know. This is, in this view, sexual ornament is a mechanism to acquire the, quote, best, unquote, mate possible. So what kinds of information? Well, they include questions like, who are his people? Does he come from a good egg? Does he have a good diet? Can he provide for our offspring? Does he smoke? Even what is he smoking? Or perhaps does he have sexually transmitted diseases? These are all the kinds of things, among the list of things. And in fact, almost any kind of imaginable value has been placed in this category. More specifically, scientifically, we can classify these in two ways. One of the benefits, adaptive benefits of mate choice would be good genes that your offsprings will inherit. And the others can be classified and generalized direct benefits, things that accrue to your own survival and fecundity of the chooser. Now, under this theory, mate choice is merely another mechanism of adaptive improvement. Beauty is a new kind of social sensory utility, an honest advertisement of adaptive advantage. Accordingly, beauty and animal subjective experiences are essentially explained away as mere adaptations. And makes the world, I think, safer for what many people strive for in evolutionary biology, which is sort of a law-like generalizations on the power of adaptation to explain the world. But I have adopted aesthetic language specifically to, I think, subvert this view, because I think that there is both more and less going on in the natural world. The view I present in the book and that I'll maintain here is that beauty and desire can co-evolve merely through the power and advantage of sexual attraction alone. I think beauty can, and frequently does, become unhinged from any adaptive advantage. No good genes, no direct benefits. How can this happen? Well, the events occur because genes for specific preferences will give rise to offspring that inherit the traits that chooser prefers, and which have the opportunity to be preferred by other individuals. So the opportunity for having sexually attractive offspring is the indirect genetic benefit of preference in the absence of adaptive advantage. And with this mechanism, ornaments don't mean anything. They merely exist as an opportunity for, present as an opportunity for evaluation. In this view, beauty arises for its own sake. Now, one aspect of the co-evolved mechanism is that behind every elaborate ornament, there's an equally co-evolved cognitive preference. So we see both two players, the aesthetic expression and the evaluation. Now, science is considered often to be a discipline that avoids discussion of values. But what I'm really proposing is that we actually need a scientific theory of the origin of value, in this case, aesthetic value, in nature, and a science of value, and as well as a science of subjective experience, two things that have been often excised or eliminated or prevented from being discussed in the sciences. Now, in the book, I try to document the evolutionary, discuss the intellectual history of these. The adaptive honest adversement argument comes to us from Alfred Russel Wallace, Amos Zahavi, and essentially is endorsed by the vast majority of the field today. The arbitrary or broadly aesthetic view comes to us from Darwin, Ronald Fisher, living population geneticists like Landy and Kirkpatrick, and is mostly thought today as an intellectual curiosity of little relevance to nature. Please come on in on this spot. So usually in my main biological seminars now, I would burrow down into the genetics of the origin of the covariance that gives opportunity for the evolution of beauty for its own sake. But in this case, I'm going to take cut a corner and give you an analogy that I hope will provide a way of thinking about this for yourself, and maybe a way to describe it to your friends like George has. And we don't do this. I'm going to compare the origin of value of beauty to the value of money. Now, originally, under the gold standard, the value of a dollar had value because it stood in lieu of a tiny piece of gold in Fort Knox. Under this mechanism, the value of the dollar is extrinsic. It's not in the dollar, it's in the gold. Now, don't ask why gold is valuable. Won't go there. In contrast, all modern currencies have abandoned the gold standard. The value of the dollar is currently, as Samuelson described it, a social contrivance. The value is the dollar itself, and it only has value because we agree to invest in it some value. So, in evolutionary biology, I think the vast majority of people in this field are on the gold standard. They believe that the value of beauty is not beauty itself, but a basket of gold that lurks behind it, whether it's good genes or direct benefits. It's something else. It's not in the beauty. It's not in the beauty itself. And the arbitrary Darwinian idea is that beauty itself is the value. It's the advantage of beauty itself, and it arises as a social contrivance. And the genetic models that skipped over are the mechanism by which that occurs. So, in the fully aesthetic Darwinian view, beauty is like modern money. So there are some other broader implications to this view. The first is that in the book, I propose that organismal minds, the cognitive processes and the subjective experience of animals, are active agents in the world. And what that means is something fundamental about mind. That mind is an emergent individual with agency, and that I really think, although I haven't dived into a battle on the theory of mind, that free will is not an exotic philosophical conjecture, but a necessary feature of any scientific explanation of the world. And animals, many animals have it. Now, Darwin's aesthetic view means also that we should reject, or at least question, modern definitions of the term fitness. To Darwin, fitness meant physical capacity to do something to further your own individual survival or fecundity. Right? It was an aspect of the individual. And then in the early 20th century, the thoroughly eugenic period of evolutionary biology, when the difference between sexual or mate choice was rejected as a meaningful mechanism, fitness was redefined in an abstract mathematical sense, in a totally new way, as the relative distribution or the relative frequency of one's genes in subsequent generations. Yet it kept, although it's an entirely distinct idea, it kept that same romantic association, purposely by using the word, with adaptation by natural selection. What it did was concatenate and confuse the contributions of natural selection on survival and fecundity and sexual selection on mate choice and mating success, creating a new term with the same potential meaning, but with obviously a difficult one. Now, what this means is that the restoration of a truly Darwinian worldview is going to be extremely hard. This has been baked into the vocabulary of modern evolutionary biology. The aesthetic view also requires that we restore Darwin's original definition of natural and sexual selection as distinct evolutionary mechanisms. It's quite clear in all of his writing that sexual selection, mate choice, can interact with adaptive forces, but is a distinct thing. And that is something that is completely missing from essentially the entire current literature. So this adaptationist framework that has dominated the 20th century has made it literally impossible to be an authentically Darwinian scientist with modern language. So as a consequence, I no longer use the word fitness. And I have to be clear, or actually most of the time I think I just assert my independent definition of sexual and natural selection and let the audience get confused. A few comments about other aspects of the book. One is that it features of, by opening up this aesthetic agency of individuals, we were in a position, particularly, and I think distinct position, to understand what happens in the context of sexual conflict when individual preferences are interfered with by sexual violence or sexual coercion. This happened because we were happened to be working on duck stacks in the lab. It turns out that, how did we get here? Well, I had an enterprising proposal from Patricia Brennan, a fantastic postdoc who's now an assistant professor at Mount Holyoke, to work on genitalia and their evolution in birds, in particular in ducks. And I thought to myself, well, I've never worked on that end of the bird before. I'm sure I'll learn a lot. But what we learned actually transformed my understanding of biology in some fundamental way, and that is where we're headed. So unfortunately, duck sex is, I think the topic of duck sex is like a gas. It expands to fill whatever volume you provide for it. So I'm going to try to start with a small thought, so I don't have yet another discussion taken over by duck sex. But in any case, for the most part, most birds, most ducks have a traditional avian breeding system where females make choices on the basis of ornaments, with cobalt preferences and ornaments. The green head, the quack, 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 the whole thing. But as nesting season approaches, unpaired males attempt to forcibly and violently assert themselves on females through forced copulation. This is the equivalent of rape in the duck world. Females resist this energetically, violently, and are often harmed or even killed in the process, so it's very harmful. This sexual violence is made possible by the fact that ducks still have a penis. The avian penis is homologous with the mammalian and human penis. It's evolved in the common ancestor of reptiles and mammals. However, it is very different, and this is other aspects of the topic that we'll gloss over. So what happens in ducks, however, or through sexual conflict in ducks, is a sexual arms race played out in the genitalia of males and females. Males in species that have lots of forced copulation evolve very large and armed penises, and females evolved vaginal complexity. And the function of this vaginal complexity is to prevent intromission and lower the frequency of fertilization during forced copulation. So basically, many species of ducks have a 98% successful, behaviorally deployable birth control device built into their vaginal tract. This is like FDA approval. And what we learned is that what that Tea Party Senate candidate Todd Akin from Missouri said about women have a way of shutting that whole thing down in response to rape is true of ducks, but in a way that exposes something fundamentally interesting about evolutionary biology, which is that freedom of choice matters to animals. Sexual autonomy is not just a theory invented by suffragettes and feminists, but is an evolved feature of the social sexual world of many species. So how does this happen? Well, if a female gets the male that she wants, with the green head of the quack, quack, quack that she prefers, then her offspring will inherit those traits, and she will receive the indirect benefits of mate choice that drive aesthetic evolution. However, if she's forcibly fertilized by forced copulation, then her offspring will inherit either a random trait or one that she's specifically rejected, which means that they'll be less likely to be sexually preferred by other females, which is a cost, an indirect genetic cost to sexual violence. What this means is that any mutation in her behavior or anatomy that allow her to assert her own autonomy, to get what she desires, will be rewarded, because those offspring will be more likely to be sexually attracted. What this means is that sisterhood is powerful, that the co-evolved aesthetic preferences of females in the population create an opportunity for a leverage that advances their own sexual autonomy. Now, the costly arms race of ducks are definitely depressing, but they're not the only thing that can happen in response to sexual conflict. And in the book, I propose another mechanism, what I call aesthetic remodeling, where females use mate choice itself to change or transform maleness, male behavior, in a way that allows them to advance their autonomy. The example of this is the bowerbird. A great example is the bowerbird. And the bowerbirds create an aesthetic structure. It's a construction. It's not a nest. It's actually a display site or a seduction theater, where females come and visit the male and visit his bower. The bowers are clearly aesthetic, and they have radiated tremendously. But the bower also provides another function, that the female can approach the male and observe his display in an intimate context. But it has walls around it, so that if the male wants to copulate, he has to go back around the outside, which gives her a chance to pop out the front. So it is a way in which she can get an intense stimulus in a context that preserves her freedom of choice. Right? And this is the analogy of four. The last third of the book has to do with human evolution, and it's way too big a topic to introduce here, but I will say that I propose in some detail that aesthetic evolution broadly and aesthetic remodeling in response to sexual conflict have had a critical role in the evolution of human sexuality, and are really key to understanding things like the evolution of pleasure, a topic that has had a notable dearth of discussion in the adaptive framework. So lastly, in concluding, I'll say that in other work, academic work, but mentioned briefly in the book, I have taken this even further, proposing a biologically based or congruent or model of aesthetics and aesthetic philosophy based on this work in evolutionary ornithology. So in that work, I propose that art is a form of communication that co-evolves with its evaluation. Right? So just as the peacock's tail and the female peahen's preferences co-evolve with one another, I propose that when Mozart invented new ways of moving from one key to another within a piece to affect some kind of emotional experience on the audience. He transformed the audience's capacity to imagine what music could be, which fed back upon music and composition itself to give rise and to encourage the development of the classical style. So this co-evolutionary feature that we find in nature is fundamental to aesthetics itself. And so ultimately, what I hope this does is propose a sort of post-human framework for aesthetics. And I'll finish by saying that in cosmology, over the last millennium, we have gradually realized that we are further and further from the organizing center of the universe. Each one of these moves, as we get to be more and more irrelevant, is associated with advance in knowledge. Right? We're learning about the Big Bang and the nature of the universe. And yet, I actually think that decentering the universe from around us has actually only led to an enhanced appreciation of this experience we're all having. Life itself, human consciousness, culture, ourselves, the things we're all doing. So I think in a similar way, by reframing aesthetic philosophy in a way that takes humans out of the organizing center of the discipline, but entertains other kinds of organisms as well, will only enhance our appreciation of the uniqueness of the human arts. So I think this work is, one of my ultimate goals in this work is to try to create a new conversation, a new interface, a new connection between evolutionary biology and the humanities. And in some ways, undo some of the damage that has happened since sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, and other disciplines have, I think, misrepresented some of the core issues in my field. So that's why it's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
I first heard about Rick not as a brilliant ornithologist, but as a guy raising chickens in his backyard 4 houses down from where we moved in August. Since then, getting to know him and learning from him has been one of the best things about being at Yale so far for me. So the evolution of beauty fascinates me for all kinds of reasons, but above all as an exemplar of feminist science. So in order to explain what I mean by feminist science, I'm going to begin by considering more generally how this book addresses the relationship between nature and ethics. So in the opening pages of the book, Rick describes the reaction of a fellow evolutionary biologist to his views. This colleague says, "But that's nihilism." And Rick is taken aback and he assumes that he hasn't been able to convey his meaning to his colleague. I'm going to argue that Rick should not resist the label of nihilism. In fact, that he should embrace it. So to make this case, I want to look briefly at the long history of efforts to avoid the nihilistic implications of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Intriguingly, Darwin too appeared to his contemporaries to be a nihilist, but for the opposite reason. If Rick's colleague was shocked at his suggestion of an organic world governed by whim, Darwin stood accused of reducing nature to iron law. Only a handful of readers in Darwin's own day recognized the true implications of his theory of natural selection. Only a few saw that Darwin was positing a world of utter contingency, void of purpose. The astronomer John Herschel, one of the few who grasped this point, aptly called natural selection the law of higgledy-piggledy. Many of the early readers of The Origin instead understood Darwin to be describing a universe governed by natural laws instead of by divine fiat, a universe devoid of both higher meaning and free will. And such determinism drew grave concern among the devout. To them, it seemed nothing short of nihilism. Those who embraced Darwin's theory went to great lengths to avoid this taint of nihilism. They did so by assuming that evolution was in fact a goal-oriented process, perhaps one even guided by the hand of God. Darwin was in part responsible for this misreading, right? The Origin contradicts itself on the question of whether natural selection can be expected to produce progress. Close readers like Herschel could see that Darwin was dispensing teleology, but more cursory readers found allusions to progress peppered throughout the text, significantly in the titles of individual chapters and their concluding paragraphs. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, often seen as the 19th century's spokesman for nihilism, insisted that evolution must be purposeful. He wrote of life itself in terms of an intentional drive or will to power. So early Darwinians chose to interpret fitness, as Rick points out, in a normative sense. Although fitness designated no more than a contingent correlation between organism and environment, it was commonly understood to represent a new standard of good living. Many of those early readers were willing to abandon theism, the belief that the world is divinely directed, but they avoided nihilism by transferring moral authority from God to nature with a capital N. That is, in place of theism and to avoid nihilism, they embraced naturalism. In this way, they maintained the equation of is and ought with its conservative implications in defense of the social status quo. Now, an important outlier in this respect was the anatomist Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley recognized Darwin's theory for what it was, sheer nihilism, a vision of nature void of purpose, inconsistent with any moral system. So, Huxley rejected naturalism. Human ethics could not be explained by evolution. On the contrary, Huxley claimed that morality was the opposite of the struggle for existence, the force that held it in check. Quote, laws and moral precepts are directed to the end of curbing the cosmic process and reminding the individual of his duty to the community. So if we turn now to Rick's neo-Darwinian theory of evolution of beauty, we find that the relationship between nature and ethics is one aspect of his theory that I think remains ambiguous. So one way to read the evolution of beauty is to see Rick as an ethical naturalist, convinced that human ethical qualities are the result of evolution, of sexual selection in particular. And I guess this reading is confirmed by his point a moment ago that we need a science of values. So I'm going to ask you why. But first, for instance, he argues that female mate choice selects for males who are amenable to females' own sexual autonomy. So feminism is a product of nature, as is the phenomenon of a heterosexual male feminist like himself. Indeed, this argument serves to legitimate his feminism. On this reading, Rick is as much an ethical naturalist as the first generation of Darwinians, and equally adept at avoiding nihilism. He shows that Darwin's second theory saves us from the nihilistic implications of his first theory, where natural selection marks out the domain of purposeless chance, sexual selection shows us the domain of purposeful taste. Ultimately, the operation of taste leads to increasing aesthetic diversity and complexity, and to the sensual pleasure they afford. So the moral standards prescribed by Rick's naturalism might be described not as nihilistic, but as hedonistic. Pleasure is the highest good. I think, though, that there's another way to read evolution of beauty, and it's one that I prefer. So on this second reading, the book is not an attempt to read human values off the natural world, not an argument that the value of women's sexual freedom or the value of cultural diversity inheres in nature itself. So why would I pursue that reading? Like many feminists, I'm wary of attempts to derive morality from nature. Doing so leaves the moral theory at the mercy of changing scientific interpretations. It subordinates moral philosophy to biology, personal convictions to scientific expertise. So I much prefer to interpret both Darwin's original theory and Rick's neo-Darwinism as versions of nihilism rather than naturalism. So on that reading, nature contains no moral prescriptions, and that means we as humans are free to make our own moral world. Abandoning the effort to ground moral values in nature might be nihilism, but it need not be shocking, nor does it give us any reason to doubt either Darwin or Rick when they find echoes of human ethics in the non-human world. So we can still follow him when he sees female sexual autonomy at work in the animal world, and we can agree with him that it has been a force in evolution, and yet reject the idea that female sexual autonomy as a human value derives from evolution. The nihilist reading is consistent as well with Rick's suggestion that we not mince words when it comes to sexual violence in the animal world. He suggests that we use the term rape rather than forced copulation, and so emphasizes that we need to separate what's natural from what's right. If you accept that we can read the evolution of beauty in this way, you might wonder what the implications are for the relationship between science and ethical commitments. So it might seem that this reading leaves Rick open to the charge of bias, of twisting his scientific interpretations to fit his ethical commitments. But is value-inflected science necessarily bad science? Not if we accept that all science is a matter of interpretation, and that human values provide important resources for interpreting nature. Seen in this way, we might say that Rick's feminism inflects his science not as a bias, but as a valence, to borrow a term from science studies scholar Sarah Richardson. Richardson uses the term valence as opposed to bias to describe the explicit and self-conscious introduction of value-laden concepts like gender into scientific practice. So Prum's evolutionary biology is not biased precisely because he doesn't smuggle feminism in through the back door. He's entirely upfront about his commitments in support of the right of a female, whether bird, ape, or human, to choose with whom and under what conditions to have sex. Feminism functions as a conceptual resource, I would argue. So rather than seeing feminist science as a contradiction, we might say that it took a feminist to see the scope of female agency in nature. Do I have a minute more?
Well, paying attention. I'm sorry. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'll end just with a couple of questions. So we might ask then whether, likewise, the discovery of diversity in nature might depend on an ethical commitment to diversity as a good, a commitment that might make an observer more open to seeing diversity around her. That's, I think, an empirical historical question, one that I've been interested in pursuing in my own research. What's the relationship between a science capable of appreciating nature's diversity and the diversity of the population of scientific practitioners who might themselves hold diversity as a value? The second question that I would raise following from this reading of the second interpretation, I think is a bigger and more urgent question about what feminist science might do for us, about the potential for new representations of the non-human world to actually affect social change. So can talking about female freedom of choice and sexual autonomy in the animal world contribute to human sexual equality? Or are changes of this sort powerless against systemic forces? Again, I think this is an empirical historical question. How much do our representations of nature actually matter for shoring up our political order or for transforming it?
So, Rick has written what I consider to be an important and a beautiful book. It's beautiful in the grace and elegance of its style, in its material, in its enthusiasm, especially for birds, and especially in its opposition to what I think of as the strident ugliness of the cheap versions of Darwinism that abound in many popular discussions. So in most evolutionary psychology, and in the speculations offered by some scantily informed humanists who've decided that Darwinism is relevant to what they do, the adaptationist program, which I'll talk about in a minute, continues its zombie existence. It's been apparently untouched by nearly 4 decades of criticism. Rick has expanded the critiques by rescuing sexual selection as an independent force of evolutionary change, and thereby he's given us a more flexible Darwinism than any that's previously been available. Now, I will want eventually to come to his principal focus, that is beauty in nature. But I want to begin with an understanding of just how his approach fits with Darwinism as it's developed since Darwin through the 20th century into the 21st. And I want to contrast that with what I think of as cheap Darwinism, which is all over the humanities, all over parts of the social sciences, and certainly all over the popular press. It comes in a crude form of adaptationism, which I'm going to give you in 2 theses. The first thesis is this. If it would be apparently advantageous for an organism of a particular type to have a particular characteristic, and if there's no decisive evidence for denying that it has the characteristic, then it's probable that natural selection has led to organisms having that characteristic. So, for example, human males are credited with an innate propensity for rape on the grounds that forcing copulation on human females would seem, at least to the naive observer, to enhance their reproductive success. So that's one of the bad features of adaptationism. See an apparently advantageous trait that's sort of an exciting feature of human psychology or behavior, and say, well, we must have it. We must have evolved to have that. Now, the obverse is also sometimes used to draw supposedly Darwinian conclusions, that if something would apparently be disadvantageous for an organism of a particular kind, then it's reasonable to conclude that natural selection would have eliminated it. Now, my own discipline, philosophy, has recently been invaded by an army of what I'm going to call, rudely, intelligent designers. They would reject the label, who believe that evolutionary debunking arguments undercut various philosophical proposals about knowledge, morality, and other topics. I'll explain why I call them intelligent designers, even though they would reject it. Intelligent designers, as opposed to standard evolutionists, think that there are kinds of traits that you couldn't possibly get through evolution under natural selection. So they look at something like the eye, or nowadays at things like the bacterial flagellum, and they say, there's no way you could get from an ancestral bacterium without it to the present one by the steps of natural selection. Well, the philosophers are worse. They say you can't get from there to here, but what here is imprecisely specified. What there is completely left in the dark, and what the evolutionary environment in which the evolution didn't take place is completely unknown. So actually, this philosophical program is far worse than intelligent design. All right, now what's wrong with these versions of adaptationism? Well, in 1981, Steve Gould and Dick Lewontin pointed out in a deservedly influential article that natural selection only acts where the traits have a genetic basis. So if you're an adaptationist who wants to make claims in the form of one of the first two principles that I outlined for you, then you have to suppose that there's some genetic basis for the traits with which you're concerned. So that would have to be genes for rape, or genes for moral sense, or something like that. Now, there are cases in which allelic substitutions have a really striking effect. Changes at a particular locus in the human genome affect whether someone will suffer cystic fibrosis or not, for example. It's staggeringly implausible that the traits on which evolutionary psychologists and my sort of highly misguided humanists focus are of this kind. It's extremely implausible, for example, that a tendency to rape or an ability to discern moral properties would have a genetic basis of this sort. Psychological properties of this kind and of this complexity result from complex interactions between genotypes and environments. And the relations are many, many, many loci, many features of the environment, many phenotypic traits. The properties that these people focus on typically belong to a suite of traits resulting from whatever underlying genotype it is. And selection is concerned not with the individual members, but with the whole package. An apparently deleterious trait that keeps good company can be carried along for the ride. An apparently advantageous characteristic might be doomed because it's associated with bad company. Serious evolutionary analysts appreciate this point. I mean, Gould and Lewontin pointed out years and years ago. They think of some traits as being byproducts of selection on a broad cluster of phenotypic features. Rick recognizes and he accepts this form of anti-adaptationism, and he calls it the byproduct view in this book. There's another important counter to adaptationism, and it arises in species that are able to transmit traits culturally. Since the 1980s, theorists have developed very sophisticated models of gene culture evolution, coevolution. The most influential work, I think, today is that of Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson, and they've proved a useful folk theorem. In species with a practice of punishment, almost any trait can be originated and maintained under the mix of natural and cultural selection. So the idea that you just can't get certain kinds of traits going in human beings is not, shall we say, very promising. Now, Rick is again happy to espouse this second style of anti-adaptationism, but when he's focusing on birds, you might think it drops out of the picture. On the other hand, when he turns to the second part of his book, when he starts talking about human beings, I think he falls into a trap of focusing on one evolutionary mechanism, sexual selection, and ignoring cultural transmission and cultural evolution. I'm going to come back to this point more generally in a moment. Now, the great achievement of Rick's book, The Evolution of Beauty, is to see that what was shown to be possible, first in preliminary form by Fisher in the 1930s, and then more recently by Russell Landay and Mark Kirkpatrick, actually plays a significant role in nature. So Landay and Kirkpatrick showed the possibility of certain kinds of evolutionary scenarios. What Rick has done, and it's an outstanding achievement, is to make a strong case for the existence of evolutionary phenomena fitting those models. So I'm going to adapt Darwin's own characterization of the origin of species and say that the evolution of beauty is in fact one long argument for the pervasiveness of sexual selection as an evolutionary force independent of natural selection. But now comes the trap and the danger. Anybody who wants to show that by giving striking examples will want to downplay other evolutionary mechanisms and other evolutionary forces. And so there are places in the book where it seems to me that it lapses into a structural analog of the adaptationist program, where instead of natural selections being seen as everything, sexual selection seems to be everything. And I'm going to give you a single example of this. It's the case of female orgasm. Here, Rick contrasts his own approach with what is called the byproduct account. The philosopher Elizabeth Lloyd is one eloquent defender of this. Now, Rick's hypothesis is the pleasure happens scenario. Human female sexual pleasure and orgasm have evolved because females have preferred to mate and remate, he emphasizes that word, with males who stimulate their own sexual pleasure. I'm quite willing to accept that this is a part of the story, even in an important part. Notice, however, that it has presuppositions. For the capacity for orgasm to arise, and for the corresponding shaping of the human penis to take place, Rick is very good on this, actually. It's very interesting. What he says is, the kind of penis males have is actually designed through this sexual selection process. But you need some original capacity for sexual pleasure, and you need some tendency for remating. It seems to be a serious possibility that both of these features involve component traits that emerged as byproducts. In other words, rather than this stark opposition of Prum versus Lloyd, we might say these are really allies. These are working together, and there's a complex story to be told involving both of these features. And I think the point's fully general. Even when the topic under consideration is some feature of avian plumage or bird behavior, the initial dispositions to be attracted to some traits and not to others might well have emerged as byproducts of natural selection. The case for sexual selection as an independent evolutionary force isn't compromised by conceding that point. I think anti-adaptationists should be thoroughly pluralistic. That makes the task of evolutionary analysis more complicated. Sometimes it will demand a number of evolutionary models, each emphasizing different aspects of an intricate scenario. And maybe there will be cases in which the idea of any complete account in which all the causal details are identified and given their due, that might turn out to be a fantasy beyond our power to articulate. But what I think Rick is pointing towards is a many-sided, pluralistic adaptationism. And now I want to close with a couple of general remarks about the project. I confess the title of the book seems to me a misnomer. Sexual selection, wonderfully brought back by Rick, is really about the evolution of attractiveness. Whether the sexually attractive should be equated with the beautiful seems to me an open question. So far as I can tell, the case for doing so depends on the thought that the traits picked out by sexual selection embody the aesthetic sense of the species in question. And that's in line with what Rick said a few moments ago. One obvious question is whether this is apt language. is it inflationary to say that there's an aesthetic sense here? Or should we talk instead of dispositions to react in specifiable ways to conspecifics with particular traits? And if there's an aesthetic sense, is it also exemplified in the reactions of the supposedly beautiful sex to their apparently humdrum mates? So is the female bird of paradise also beautiful? Can sexual attractiveness come apart from beauty, as it apparently does in the human case? I think the days are long past when the behavior of non-human animals could only be characterized by referring to tropes, instincts, reactions, and the like. Thanks to a lot of people's efforts, people who've studied primates, dolphins, elephants, corvids, canids, and so on, we now recognize a rich array of psychological states in some of our non-human relatives. Yet in talking of beauty as frequently as he does, it seems to me that Rick raises questions about how some of his claims are to be understood and justified. And if we equip each species with its own notion of beauty tied to sexual attractiveness, I think we'd start to lose an important link. A link with beauty as human beings understand it. Beauty for the Argus pheasant evolves in Argus pheasants through sexual selection. Beauty for the Argus pheasant has no necessary connection with beauty for human beings. And part of what I think drives Rick's inquiry is the thought that he shares with many other ornithologists that many features of many birds are beautiful, period. Part of the project of the book is to explain how beauty, as we conceive of it, across the board has evolved. With the relativization to individual species, the link that would generate that explanation seems to me to be severed. And my second concern is related. Rick has talked a lot about female sexual autonomy. Like Darwin, he's inclined to talk about options and choices made by birds. He sees them as in some sense free. I think the concept of autonomy is hard enough to articulate and defend in the human case. The long history of worries about determinism is a reminder of the permanent possibility of skepticism. I think the worries arise with even greater force in the reactions of birds to their potential mates. Is there room here for talk of decision-making? Sexual selection, a more sober and mundane ornithologist might say, could be powered by simple dispositions to take up an inviting posture under some circumstances and to fly away under others. I worry that the language of autonomy has the same metaphorical character as Dawkins's famous and much contested talk of selfish genius. Now, my reservations are small compared with my admiration for the overall achievement of this book. I like to think that future scholar historians will find in it a clue to the demise of adaptations. The murder was committed by Professor Prum in the bird line with a bandit. Thank you very much.
Okay, there is a lot on the table. I would love to hear Rick respond to all of these really interesting questions. But I think it's important that you, the audience, raise your questions now. So why don't we open it up to everyone, and we'll see if there's a moment when we want to pause and have Rick do a response if he wants to. But
Eager.
yeah, we're eager to hear questions. So. A single question. Yes. Sure.
So it seems to me that birds are pretty peculiar creatures that are not representative of the animal kingdom in general, right? They tend to be mostly diurnal, visual, and half of them are pair bonded. If you take mammals and even primates, many are nocturnal, non-pair bonded. So in a species that has promiscuous mating system, for example, partner's choice does not matter that much. Or at least it's not about aesthetics, it's about status, it's about fertility, right?
I have avoided in the book and in this presentation today, the whole broader field of behavioral ecology, which is the science of the establishment of the ecology and conditions under which reproduction happens, the context for choice, and whether or not it occurs at all. There are certainly lots of species that don't have opportunities for choice, and I think the observation that they may not have elaborate preferences or elaborate forms of ornament is right in line with the idea. But one of the things that makes birds so relevant is that they just happen to share two of our most dynamic and relevant sensory modalities, color vision and sound. So we can really relate to them, and that's certainly the fact of avian beauty to us is certainly motivating to the kind of study that we do. But there are certainly all sorts of other forms of beauty that we can't relate to. There are more myriad fishes in Africa and gymnodid fishes in South America that live in such murky water. Under any light, vision is impossible or unsuccessful. So they create electrical fields, and as objects around them distort those fields, they can feel that. But they feel the world in electrical fields. These same groups have also evolved to sing songs. They do mate attraction songs. And they vary in frequency and tempo, like music, but in an entirely different kind of wave that we can't imagine. Now, we could take microphones or electrophones or whatever they are in the rivers, and you go to Africa or the Amazon, and you will pick up whole communities of these things. It's lit up with aesthetic signals, right? So there's also olfaction would be another one. I think there are many ways in which this can evolve. So I imagine aesthetic evolution as for those sensory perception, evaluation, and choice is occurring in lots and lots of different places that treat life independently, and in many mammals it's not occurring. In some organisms that are so undense that they might mate as soon as they get an opportunity in the right season, run into a conspecific of the right sex, no choice at all. Or if males have antlers and they're just controlling the food, you go where the food is, and de facto your mate will be that individual. So there's lots of other issues, and of course birds are great because they're so aesthetically extreme and allow this kind of work to go on.
How do you think about the genetic structure, architecture, and the neural structure of the preference that all evolves within trait?
Yeah, so I don't think we know anything about that currently. Even in Drosophila, people haven't taken sexual selection seriously enough to explore that, even when we could, right? And I think that just shows the low level of status of sexual selection as an evolutionary idea. Clearly, it is many genes of small effect interacting together. Probably the best data on that come from a weird animal called the stalk-eyed fly. And stalk-eyed flies have really wide heads. The males have eyes that stick out. They're Drosophila, they're related to Drosophila, and the males have stalks, eyes on their stalks that are almost as long as the whole body. They're quite small, but pretty impressive. And they butt heads, but they're also under female choice. And someone selected lines for long stalks and short stalks. And interestingly, got, without selecting on preference, got correlated change in female preferences. When they selected on long eyes, they got more stronger preference for long stalks. And when they selected for short, they got preferences for so this idea of covariance between the traits and the preferences is at least present in some of these species. Of course, Philip mentioned culture. Humans are not the only species with sexual culture.
birds, half the birds in the world, learn their songs from other members of their species. And so they vary culturally, and the variations that birds invent live longer than the individual birds that invent them. The birds in New York, Boston, and Chicago sound differently, just like the people do, for basically the same exact reason. Right? So they have lots of, and of course they are sexual advertisements and sexual preferences that are determined culturally. So ornithology, like the humanities and human biology, has to deal with culture and biological evolution simultaneously as well.
I had a comment and a question. The comment is that George Simmel, the German sociologist, wrote a book on the science of value called The Philosophy of Money, which might, he's a vitalist, of course, but it might be relevant to your initial
The
comment.
philosophy of money?
Yeah, Simmel's book. Another point, the question is, a lot of what sounds like adaptation is sort of rolls up to a higher level of complexity science. And I'm wondering if that, is an accurate sort of summarization of adaptationism.
That adaptation is...
And complexity science, right? I mean, complexity science is more European than American, but the Santa Fe Institute is an example of an American foundation that is complexity focused, and they have a lot to say about evolution. They have a lot to say about evolutionary psychology, but it's sort of a higher order of.
I mean, I haven't done the formal work in this area that I need to do, but it's pretty intimidating to do. But I'll tell you where I really come from. I think that individuality, both as in the biological sense, me or this stuff, or in the historical sense, like taxa, higher taxa, mammals, or historical entities that have individuality. I really think that individuality is is associated with an emergent agency that is not reductive and is completely scientific. So I find myself in this odd case of being completely convinced of a philosophy of science that is not represented yet. So, but in any case, I think that the Santa Fe Institute complexity folks are usually about describing the complicated in a way that is still reductive, but reductive in a way that gives opportunities. So they don't recognize that, so I think, like my colleague Robert Schulman, one of the, in physics and molecular biology at Yale, who has done a lot with functional MRI. His concept in humans is that, the person is not the brain. The person is using the brain to affect their ends, right? So this is the kind of emergent mechanisms that I think are not reduced by, or that don't fit into the Santa Fe mind.
Could I follow up with, I mean, if you think in terms, you mentioned the Big Bang.
Please, I'm really hard
Right.
sorry.
You mentioned the Big Bang. That's probably the original singularity, the origin of everything. But the next step, probably the next big singularity, was inorganic life coalescing into some bacterial microorganism life form, right? So we evolved out of primordial slime, if you will, and a massive amount of biotic life on Earth is microorganism, which has no morphological structure. So is there any way to make your theory of evolution of beauty relevant to microorganisms, prokaryotic, so on?
I got an email about this just yesterday from a virologist in Germany, so I just had a chance to answer. And maybe bacteria or some people who work in these areas could inform me. I don't necessarily see the same kind of agency yet that they might recognize. However, there is this quirky, one of the issues about coevolution of preference and trait, it's related to a ubiquitous biological phenomenon, which is a ligand attaching to a receptor. All the cells of our bodies are communicating these ways, and single cell organs also communicate in these ways, or pheromones, social and sexual signals attaching to olfactory receptors. In order to make these signals work, they just have to attach, but not be confused with other such signals. So there's certainly a space where you don't want to go, but where they evolve to, it can be highly arbitrary. And there's something, molecular biologists might say deeply beautiful or arbitrary. There's, the receptor and the trait, as long as they still attach, or the light end of the receptor, as long as they still attach. So these are aspects, similar phenomena that have something like the unpredictability or the at least non-optimal solutions that are still effective in other areas of biology that go way down to bacteria.
But there's no agency or choice or autonomy in the.
Well, I mean, I think if we had a graded concept of agency, I'm really in bird choice. I'm really suggesting that they are choices the same way we experience them and understand them and etc. So they're very similar. But obviously, these are kinetic interactions in these molecular. It can't be the same kind of agency, but maybe a concept of agency is something that we need to understand. Good.
As somebody who comes at this from the beauty side toward that, I find myself learning so much from this that I almost hesitate to bring this up, but I do so timidly. For me, it's the beauty definition that remains completely undefined. And is such a, for me, it's kind of an anthropomorphic imposition on behaviors of creatures who may find sexual selection a drive that they need to satisfy or wish to satisfy, or find all sorts of ways in which they identify with each other that are not purely instrumental, shall we say. But the definition, a workable definition of aesthetic beauty would be helpful to somehow find out what we are.
I think I have one. Beauty is the quality or the property that we experience in a co-evolved attraction. That is where the subject and the regard for it have shaped one another over previous time. And that we're attracted to them because of that history. There are lots of things that are in that category, and there are things that are not in there. And I propose the ones that are in are the beautiful, and the ones that are not beautiful or are projections of this aesthetic preferences. So I probably have to go in and debate more examples to make that clear how that would work.
Philip,
so this is really where my worry about the tie between sexual selection, attractiveness, and beauty kicks in. Because I do think that our conception of what is beautiful is quite different. I mean, there's overlap, of course, from our conception of what is sexually attractive. And we can, we ascribe the property of beauty to all kinds of phenomena that seem completely remote from the sexual sphere. Now that could I suppose be a spin-off from the practice of finding certain kinds of other human beings beautiful. But it also seems to me that actually there are women, men who are sexually attractive who are downright ugly, and there are women, men who are beautiful and who are not sexually attractive. So I mean, it seems to me that something has gone. I mean, you need a story that's going to cover all these cases.
I think I have one, and I think you're assuming that there's one origin of the perception of beauty in humans, but I've never proposed that. The origin of music would give an opportunity for cognitive evaluation, or potential cognitive evaluation and choice, which is a totally different place and time than sexual beauty, which evolved much earlier. And so as a consequence, then beauty is not necessarily about sex at all. And so the notion that there are many aesthetic processes, they occur in different times and places, and so I don't think that one is necessarily fundamental to the other.
Okay, so, but when I say you need a story, you need to take on the hard cases in which it seems that the notion of beauty is quite remote from sexual selection and show how some hypothetical series of sexual selection events gave rise to elementary processes which in combination would yield that. Otherwise, it seems to me that the challenge that has just been issued and the challenge that I issued has not been met.
Yeah, or you should change the way you think about beauty. Which I'm perfectly happy with. I mean, people might be thinking wrong about beauty forever, and that I don't think my notion is actually that different from the way people are thinking about it. But if we have a workable, useful set of intellectual tools that allows us to study this in an interesting new way, why not change the way we think about beauty? I'm perfectly.
May I just say, I'm very sympathetic because what you've done is eliminate a discussion of beauty as having distinct attributes which we can identify and begin to generalize about. Beauty is this and this and this. You are getting a dynamic, interactive.
This is not a reductive model.
So
in that sense, that's why I think it's really compatible with a lot of. We have one question, right? Raising his hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
Okay. So I was just wondering about to what degree your story of natural selection, sort of more of like an adaptation to the material world, and sexual selection are really can be disaggregated, because this act can be like taken apart or can be taken as independent of each other, because it seemed like when you were talking about duckling, is that what the ducks were doing, what the really ugly ducks were doing, was that they were basically trying to short circuit this like hierarchy and regime of wind that they couldn't like find a place for themselves for. So it seems like what's really like has to be, and I think Professor Kitcher mentioned something about like how any regime of punishment can sustain a trait as long as it's like sufficiently deep within sort of the society that it tries to control. But it seems like there first has to be a story of like how there have to be conditions for women to emerge as something that can dictate sexual selection, right? So of course it's not the case that female autonomy. I mean, and it's of course it's well documented in human history that people use use sexual violence in order to actually eliminate this kind of diversity too, right? I mean, at least like within like human populations. And I think, so I'm also wondering to what degree that actually contradicts with the story that you're saying. And also, just like as a footnote, I think there's also many cases in which there are aesthetic innovations that come out with actual like men coercing women. Like to pick out one example, it would be like male cults in a lot of sort of tribal societies in which they'll dress up as ghosts in order to basically convince women not to run away. But yeah.
So first on the issue of natural and sexual selection, are they separate? I agree that we need a pluralistic framework, and I don't think that evolutionary biology is going to suddenly say, okay, we're going to chuck out this concept of fitness and use it for 100 years, 80 years, and go with Prum's idea, or get rid of this word. But I'm hoping that I can. There's some niche available for this to grow in evolutionary biology. But in the book I have a couple examples where we have to analyze it as distinct, and one of them has to do with a bird, and maybe I can pull up this slide.
The slides are terrific.
Yeah.
So let's see here. So back when we go to the front, and let's see.
Yeah, okay, good. So, and this is a bird featured in chapter 4, and it's called the club-winged manakin. So this is a bird that's it's singing with its wings. Wang is and I first saw this in 1985 in Western Ecuador, and it took us 20 years to figure it out. That's the way it works sometimes. And here's the work of Kim Bostic now is pointing out. This is a high-speed 500 frames a second showing the oscillation of the feathers over the back at 100 cycles per second. But the sound is at 1,400 cycles per second. So how does that work? Well, to make a long story short, it's got these weird club-shaped secondaries that rub against one another. So the blade on the fifth secondary rubs over the bumps on the sixth, right? As creating mechanically. So this is a very weird thing, and it turns out that Kim Boswick has also shown that beauty is not merely skin deep. In order to make this beautiful sound, the wing bones and the musculature have greatly evolved. And this is a CT scan here showing what we have here is the humerus, the radius, and the ulna of this bird are solid. Right? That's a big deal because there's no other bird in the world that doesn't have, where he's not hollow. In fact, T-Rex has a hollow ulna, right? And so this is a feature that goes back to before the origin of flight and birds. And here's the oldest instrument known in the world is a flute made from a vulture bone. It turns out it's an ulna. So a thick flute, and you've got a pretty good idea what an ulna looks like. And this is the ulna of the clubwing, which is just totally weird, right? And this is, of course, it's clearly costly. It's got several orders of magnitude denser calcium than regular bone, but those costs could be interpreted by adaptationists as an example of a handicap. You know, you're investing so much in this ornament because you're showing how good you are. So I decided to examine this by looking at females, and it turns out that was really hard to even find the specimens that would allow this to be possible, but we did, and it turns out that the female has almost identical ulna to the male. It's not solid, it's got about 50% hollow space in the middle, but it still has the same weird shape. The reason is that the wing bones, or the bones in general, the skeleton, develop in the embryo, in the egg, before it has developed any differentiated sex. So females, by selecting on those males that they like, will have male offspring with sexually attractive wing songs. But they will also have daughters that will inherit those weird wing bones. And so I refer to this as the evolution of decadence. And we've done some theory on it, and it turns out that we were scooped by both Kirkpatrick and Landy in ways that we didn't know. The student who did the work presented it at Evolution maybe last year, and one of the guys said at the end, "Oh, so it turns out you were scooped before you were born." I think he was a little depressed about that, but we felt good that we had actually trod the path and got to the same thing, which is that this can happen. That basically the survival costs to one's daughters can be traded off by the sexual advantages of having offspring. Male children that are sexually attractive, right? But there is actually nothing necessarily to prevent this thing from leading to extinction. So, I was talking to a journalist about this, and he said, "You seem really delighted by this prospect." And I thought, well, maybe a little bit, I don't know. But the real reason why I think it's important is because when natural selection and sexual selection are working in exactly opposite directions, that's when you realize that the old view is under stress, and that you really have a benefit from intellectually separating it. So there's a lot more in there, people, et cetera, in your questions. I don't know quite where to go from there.
Yes. No, it's just more of like, it seems like the old rules, it is like, you are going against, this doesn't apply in the imperial court, right? Like, it's, like, I don't know. And I think even this is a bird that doesn't learn its song. But it doesn't even apply in birds always. You have culture, but of course culture often means you're more likely to be unhinged from adaptive measures than necessarily playing out adaptation.
Yes.
I want to actually give you a chance to answer Professor Coen and Professor Kitcher's questions, because I thought they were very interesting, and especially I'd like you to respond to Professor Coen's, two interpretations of your story, and the idea that in the first one you were actually locating ethics in nature, which has some real features, and to Professor Kitcher's question about whether you know, the language of autonomy can have poses the same dangers as the language of, say, the selfish gene. So, you know, those are both coming really from the same, those questions are coming from the same place.
Right. So first, I'm fully prepared to be a nihilist. You know, I guess where do I sign up? I need to. I mean, my response to that question was because to the adaptationist behaviorists who say, well, that's nihilism. You know, meant to him, you know, why would I get out of bed in the morning? I don't have any reason to do my work. And obviously that's a not a relevant way to think of it. But indeed, I do think that the second model, the model of learning from nature but not deriving moral value from what's going on in ducks is the appropriate path. Right? And so I would aspire to a feminist science that is not that takes up this information as relevant, but doesn't see biology as the source of human political theory. So, and I think that's appropriate, and I think that makes the discovery of these things in nature even more valuable, more interesting. They didn't get there because they were looking for them, they rose. Now, the second
Autonomy.
on
choice.
on autonomy. You know, I see if the notion of sexual autonomy in nature has anything close to the impact of the concept of the self-esteem, and then later we regret it and draw it back, 5%, I'm totally prepared to be sacrificed as having gone too far. So, part of this is a rhetorical and sociological exercise. How do we get, how do we recruit scientists into the field that want to study this in this way? And so I don't yet see the downside to these to these concepts. And actually, there's a footnote in the book. One of my Yale colleagues has written in the law school has written recently a paper, Jen Rubenfeld, on the myth of sexual autonomy, and does an analysis of this law and concludes that it's the wrong basis for rape and sexual harassment law, and yet the exact form of sexual autonomy that he, in a 40 or 60-page paper that he discards in a page and a half or a half a page, is actually the form that you see arising in ducks. And I think his analysis is really pretty shallow. Now, is that relevant? Well, I can't say where's biology. It's not going to justify a legal concept of sexual conflict, but it's certainly correct to point out that this idea that you thought was silly is happening in nature. And so I think that there is an opportunity for the kind of feedback that Deborah was pointing to between these observations and our political and feminism in our world.
Can I suggest to both you and Debbie, there's a nicer name for nihilism. It's constructivism, right? Because the other side of the phenomenon that the values aren't there in nature is that they are constructs that come out at a particular stage in the evolution of a particular species. Notice that Darwin introduces sexual selection. It's the main topic of The Descent of Man, right?
Yep.
But at the very beginning, he struggles to say, to understand the continuities of our species with the rest of nature. And he's particularly worried by the moral sense. And so he gives this account of how, he says, any being possessed of enough intelligence and having a certain kind of social life and having certain kinds of sympathies would eventually develop a moral sense. So the idea is that something grows, something in us evolves, and out of that we create the values. So in in becoming a nihilist, you are identifying yourself even more closely with Darwin. But I recommend that you attend to the constructive part of it rather than the negative.
I need to take on my syllabus for you guys before I'm fully aware. Yeah, I think construction is, I mean, I spoke to the notion of social contrivance, right? That the context, we didn't talk about speciation diversity, but often these are continuing on, right?
So as a constructivist myself, I'm delighted to recruit you.
Any other questions? I did want to ask you, one of the things about the feminist aspect of your work was, you talk not only about the birds, emphasizing female choice, but you talk about how the structure of modern evolutionary Darwinism is itself entirely masculine in perspective. And I wondered if you could say a little word about that.
Well, I think what's happened is that the adaptationist view, especially when taken into human biology and human origins, has really emphasized these erroneous or overly simplistic adaptationist models that frankly reinforce the comforting view that patriarchy has of maleness, the naturalness of sexual coercion, the naturalness of male cultural and political dominance. And the book goes to great lengths, maybe bends over backwards, to show that model is an incomplete way of looking at human origin. And that, I actually propose that without expansion without selection by females to expand their sexual autonomy, that we would not be here having this conversation. That the difference between, anyway, so that this aesthetic remodeling, that aesthetic sexual autonomy expansion has been critical to the origin of humans as a distinct thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
So just as a follow-up then, you said we need a scientific theory of origin of values. Why do we need it? Yeah.
I think that I think I'm developing one, right, which is derived from Lenny Kirkpatrick and recognizing that this is about the origin and diversification of aesthetic value in species, right? And what is good and what's bad, and that exists. And I think that maybe that's a model. I've assiduously stayed away from all discussion of evolution of ethics, but maybe that's a similar or has some relation to that field as well. And again, an emergent feature of particular species or lineage, whether it reaches the condition where the kind of events
I love your theory. It's very attractive. It's still drafting to try to understand it. In a way, what kind of going on what you're saying, what would define beauty as the residual that cannot be explained by kind of more utilitarian selection reasons. And so I want to understand what you're saying as a view of the mind. In a way, this is the residual that other theories cannot explain. So in a way, this is theory that's not falsifiable unless you can prove or find a reason for all the natural selection without any residual that one cannot do beauty. Is this the way you see it?
I think the mating preferences and their actions, the kind of foraging choices that bees make at flowers, they're much more central issues in the biology of these species than a residual of things we can't yet explain. So I resist that and say, no, these things are staring us right in the face, and we have to explain them. And the only explanation we can think would have to have this aesthetic element, because there are many aspects of nature that don't function in the normal material world, but function through evaluation in the brains of animals, and whether they be bees or birds feeding on fruits or organisms selecting amongst various mates. So these are essential questions, not just the stuff left over.
Right, but I mean, God forbid if your theory was wrong, would one disprove it? What would disprove it?
Sure. I think that if we found, for example, that preferences and traits don't co-evolve, or species where they don't, that'd be pretty fundamental, falsification. I think the evidence is really good. Every single bird on the planet has some kind of sexual mate choice going on. That means it occurred back just after, some point in the Mesozoic era, and we've got 10,000 plus species of bird, each one of which has a different notion of what beauty is, and they've radiated in that time. Almost every species, almost every time, almost all mate choices are made within a species. So that's de facto evidence that they started with one concept of beauty, and now we got 10,000, and there's this correspondence. So I think the evidence for that is overwhelming, but there are plenty of places where it may not be. Yes?
Maybe a last question on light side. So you convince us in the book that women have been quite at work selecting better men. Men that are better than, gorillas, little kids and so on and so forth, and men that are also much more cooperative with each other, which have implications for the development of culture and technology and so on and so forth. So why haven't we done better?
I argue at length in the book that that human sexual autonomy, or female sexual autonomy, is really a primary expansion, is a primary explanation why we're here. So why aren't we living in a world completely of realized autonomous and of freedom of choice? Well, the answer is money, and maybe agriculture too. As soon as there was wealth, then you had the capacity to aggregate it. It distorted reproduction to mean certain kinds of investment could be there. And that changed human culture in a really huge way. Barbara Smuts, an evolutionary anthropologist and primatologist, proposed in this fantastic paper back in the early 90s on the evolution of patriarchy. And if you examine across primate species, the more hierarchical the species, the male structure, the lower the female power in that species, right? This seems to be something that's playing out tremendously in humans. It also worries me considerably, amazingly, that there are all sorts of unexpected impacts to the distortion of the income distribution in this nation in the last 40 years. And this is another one of them. So it's maybe not surprising that we're re-experiencing battles over access to birth control and reproductive health services as hierarchy in our culture gets greater and greater. So, but that's one of these things where I hope awareness of these ideas leads to some new kinds of thought and work in this area.
I think we have just about done it. So let us thank all of